Hello and welcome to Alchemy for 21st Century Rebirth of Resistance. My name's Gary.
My name is Kevin.
And we're here to talk with you about current events. And what we're going to talk about today is economics, because everything we're seeing today is rooted in economics. So what we're going to do is a comparison between economic models. So what we could sort of say here is that the old model that most of us are familiar with probably began right around sometime in the 1900s. And it was relatively based on some basic principles. One could say it was based on scarcity, production slash investment, consumers slash labor. So what we have here is that if you look at this, it's scarcity because the model was domestic, so you only have so much resources. Also too, as you have productivity, and productivity, as it increased, it got investments. As it increased, labor increased. As labor increased, consumers increased, because there's a direct relationship here. The more labor you have, the more consumers you have. The more consumers get paid, the more profits you make, the more you can invest, the more you can expand. Okay, and this is relatively a model that probably reached its zenith sometimes in the late 40s and 50s. This is the model that most people think about when they think about economics, the old 50s paradigm. Okay, and what we could sort of say here too is this model has a limit. It will reach a peak. And what happens at this peak, one begins to realize that the creation of consumers through labor actually begins to cost you profits. And we can sort of say that this model began to decline in the 70s. And what we see here is it begins to become replaced with so-called the model of the 1980s, which is relatively Globalism point 2, because what we have here is Globalism 1 began before 1914, and this is why we see similarities between now and then. So we move into Globalism 2, and Kev can tell you a little bit about that.
Well, Globalism 2 is based on what we would call abundance, market participation in emerging markets.
Yes, exactly. And I say it too, and it's abundance. I'll pick up a little bit on that for you, Kev. Is abundance, okay, means that it is global. It has reaches into more resources. Also, too, is it uses technology and automation for expansion.
Exactly.
Okay, and what you have here is you have market participation, which means that everything is somewhat measured by that, which is the product of emerging markets, which is investment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Kev, tell us about the two equations we have here. What's the equation for the old model?
Well, this is the standard equation. This is just basic. The elementary equation is Y equals C, consumption plus government spending plus investment plus balance of payments, which is exports minus imports. This is your old model.
Thank you, Kev. And I would sort of say, too, is being that was the domestic one, I imagine the global one is probably changed.
I'm not saying this is exactly the model, but this is the new model is based on, I would say, something similar to this equation, where you have GDP equals consumption plus consumption times a function of government plus investment times investment times a function of government plus direct government spending plus balance of payments equals exports domestically produced plus imports domestically produced minus imports times international production.
Wow, what a change in that.
Yeah.
But I think too is we can sort of say that maybe that equation begins to explain why
the stock market is at historic highs when sometimes the reality in the national economy doesn't reflect those numbers.
Exactly, it doesn't reflect the numbers when you think about it, okay, because it always gets revised. And also, too, this is not something just Western, it's also in other economies.
Oh, yeah.
China's the same way.
Exactly.
So it's sort of somewhat global. And I would sort of think, too, is could this also relate to the inflated gross domestic product readings?
Yes, it could.
Yeah, it could.
Yes, it could.
Yeah, it could, because it's measured on the back end.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so it makes an inflated thing, which again means to be revised. Okay, so I say too, if we sort of take this and go back to the old domestic model and think about Kevin's equation here, what we have is the domestic models of the West. And I'm not talking all the West. I'm talking primarily the old ruling models of the West. Okay, now what you have here is they appear to be in a state of stagnation, and that could be because private investment or capital investment has left. What happens now?
You have a dead weight loss.
Government takes on a new function.
And you also have a dead weight loss.
Yes.
And that,
Okay.
you have to think of you have to think of the role that the government plays. You have to change that. As we see in the 08, 09, there was a direct payment to the private sector. This would be your QEs, your
Too big to fail stimuluses.
yeah.
Okay.
But if you change the way you look at government, you would realize that there's also what I call a backdoor stimulus, where you have either a cut in taxes or an increase in entitlements.
Exactly, because too, what you're sort of saying here is now the economy, okay, becomes more dependent upon government.
Government's role has changed.
Has changed, okay? And then two is even though if you have a back door or front door, it both filters back up to domestic businesses.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So I say too, government's role has significantly changed in some ways.
Yeah.
Okay. It's probably always had a role, but now it's a bigger role.
Now it's a bigger role. It's more important, and the government is one of the at a certain level provides the income or the disposable income for the consumers to take part in the economic activity.
Yeah. Market participation.
Market participation in the national economy.
Exactly. Okay. And I'm sort of thinking here too is that this new role was probably one of the hot buttons of the political debates.
Oh, they're debating it as we speak.
As we speak, okay? And also, too, this is not only just for us, we can see this also happening in Europe. Because you're seeing QEs and stimuluses in there.
Oh, yes, global.
Okay, so tell me, Kev, what do you think is the consequence of this new model?
I would say that the consequence of this new model is that because the government plays a different role and that the economies are not based on labor, you have what I would call, as I said earlier, a dead weight loss.
That dead weight loss. And what is that, Kev?
Well, it has a face.
Yes, it does.
It's
Many faces.
It's those who are not going to directly participate in the labor market, but they have to be participants in terms of market participation. As I said earlier, the government provides the funds, they market participation, and this is the new model.
Yes, and what you have here, if you look at Western economies, and not all, and what we're beginning to see too in some Western economies is the idea of a living wage. And this fits what Kevin's talking about. Okay, if we look at this, that Western economies are functioning basically somewhere between 60 and 70% of their workforce actually employed. 45% of that, okay, is poverty or just above, so there's no unemployment benefits any longer, okay, and we also have what's called the 32% to 35% dead weight loss, and that is your ones that are not employable and not needed. Okay, and that's the face you're talking about.
That's the face I'm talking about.
Okay, and being two is this model, and other consequences of this is loss of opportunities, loss of dignity, and then sometimes loss of hope.
And loss of human capital.
Yeah.
And the potential for ideas to come not only from the top, but maybe from the bottom.
Yeah, exactly. So there is consequences to this. And we can see this consequences that usually could be on a global scale. And in some areas, it's even more insidious.
No, yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, you can see this happening throughout the world. And so what we have here is not, we have a different type of war on poverty. It is not about lifting people up. It's about warehousing them.
And you got to ask yourself, is it sustainable? And I would say yes, it is for the short term.
Exactly, okay? Because what you have here is that dead weight loss will shrink in time, and possibly by 2025, okay, is that it would be under control.
Exactly.
Okay, and then what happens, okay, is that the domestic economy may re-emerge because it will meet global standards because the old ideas are gone. The old memories.
Oh, yeah. See that happening now with the immigration. Bring in the new labor force. They have no historical perspective from which to draw their self-worth from.
Well, thank you, Kev. That was great. That was great sticking that in there for us because that's 100% true because that explains the immigration that we're seeing.
Either forced or otherwise.
Yes. And two, as we begin to look at this a little bit more, is this is probably going to be the way it is.
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't appear like it's going to be the so-called recovery, but a change.
I'm morphing.
A morphing, yes. Now, two is, I hope that you like our interpretation today of things. And I think two is, and this brings us to a date of interest, and that date of interest is June 20th, give or take 3 days.
We're not saying anything bad's going to happen, but you probably need to keep an eye on that.
Keep an eye on that, because what sort of happens here is this is going to be a time of direction, and this direction either occurs because people become aware of something new or through orchestrated events that pushes us in their direction.
Exactly.
And if you like our interpretation, get a chance, you could check out our website, because in order to understand the 21st century,
you must use a 21st century paradigm.
Exactly, thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Bye-bye.